Hi. It's been a little bit. I'm in a very strange mood right now, so I figured it might be time for another one of these. I feel tired, but also apathetic a little bit. I don't know. It's strange. So we're gonna read Mr. Nobody, if that's alright. Um, the fun part about getting to select which ones I do is that I have to try and guess what moral it will be by the title and the depiction of the character alone. Because I don't read these in advance. I feel like that detracts from the beauty of it. So yeah, let's go through Mr. Nobody and let's see if we can appreciate anything in it. I imagine that we will be able to. Also, something I didn't exactly know is that Roger Hargraves died a long time ago, and it's actually his son who had been writing the books, or had been finishing them off of ideas of his father's. Um, but he still writes under the name Roger Hargrave. But on the inside cover, it always mentions Adam, which I don't know. I just thought it was something interesting. Mr. Nobody by Rod. Oh, so creaky. Mr. Nobody by Roger Hargraves, illustrated by Roger Hargraves and Adam Hargraves. So clearly, some work was used before Roger Hargraves passed away. Hello. Meet Mr. Happy. Happy by name and happy by nature. And now I'm going to tell you a story. Actually, this story isn't about Mr. Happy. Well, not really. It's about somebody he met not very long ago. Last month, in fact. Mr. Happy had been to tea with Little Miss Sunshine. He thought about catching a bus to take him home, but as it was such a nice day, he thought again and decided to walk. And he was glad he did. Would you like to know why? So depicted here is Mr. Happy. They're showing us Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy, as they say, is happy by name and nature. He's a happy guy. However, he's not the one we're exactly concerned about right now. Mr. Nobody is. So I imagine that we will get into a bit more detail into who Mr. Nobody is. I shan't tell you. The narrator is talking back to us. Not yet, anyway. Mr. Happy was whistling to himself as he walked along when he heard a noise. He stopped. There it was again. A sort of sniffing noise. Sniff, sniff, sniff. Suddenly, a drop of rain splashed on top of his head. So there's Mr. Happy looking very confused and worried in the drop above him. I would also be concerned if I heard very loud sniffing while I was walking home. I don't blame Mr. Happy for having a bit of concern in this scenario, but um, I'm very interested to see where this goes. That's odd, he thought to himself, looking up. There isn't a cloud in the sky. And then he couldn't believe his eyes. You'll never guess what Mr. Happy saw. There, sitting on the branch of a tree, was somebody who sort of was, but wasn't. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. And he was crying real big, fat, wet tears. I'm not supposed to laugh. I'm not supposed to, yet here we are. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. You could see him, you could see through him, and he was crying real big, fat, wet tears, which of course were what had splashed on top of Mr. Happy's head. Did. I just. Who needs to speak properly? So obviously, Mr. Happy is depicted on the bottom, and Mr. Nobody is sitting up in the tree branch. I guess it's not explicitly stated that this is Mr. Nobody, but it can be inferred that this is Mr. Nobody. So it seems that Mr. Happy is going to have a very crucial part in Mr. Nobody's arc. And I think that having a solid supporting cast is always important. Who, Mr. Happy managed to splutter, are you? The person who sort of was, but wasn't, looked mournfully down at him, and in a mournful, melancholy voice replied, "Nobody." "Nobody," gasped Mr. Happy. "But everybody's somebody." The person who sort of was, but wasn't, sighed deeply. "Except me," he said, and he started to cry more, real big fat wet tears. This is supposed to be serious, but when they say real big fat wet tears, it's making it a bit difficult. I must be honest. Mr. Happy is dumbfounded at the revelation that the man who is somebody but sort of not nobody is nobody. I love the pronoun game. Alrighty. Mr. Happy scratched his head, which was getting quite wet by this time. "Can you get down?" he wondered. "Possibly," replied Mr. Nobody, and he climbed down out of the tree. "Where have you come from?" asked Mr. Happy. "Nowhere," Mr. Nobody sighed, the sort of sigh that breaks your heart. "I know I used to be somebody, but I can't remember who," he sniffed. "Or what," he sniffed. "Or where," he sniffed. "Or when," he sobbed. So I think instead of sniffed, it's more like sniffled and like like a weepy exhale. Not like, not that exactly. More of like a crying while doing it. So it's just context clues for different word choices. But yeah, Mr. Nobody, I would assume suffers from some kind of amnesia. It sounds like it because he can't remember. He knows he's somebody, but he doesn't know who. Mr. Happy couldn't help but stare. It isn't often that you meet somebody that you can see right through. "I think," said Mr. Happy, "you'd better come home with me." "Why?" sobbed Mr. Nobody. "Because," said Mr. Happy, "we must do something about you." "There's nothing you can do about a nobody," wept the person who sort of was, but wasn't. "Of course there is," said Mr. Happy. "Follow me." Here they are on the nice walk home, Mr. Happy and Mr. Nobody. So very, very clearly, Mr. Happy doesn't want to give up on Mr. Nobody, even though he's already given up on himself. And you need friends to pick you up sometimes, or acquaintances that you cry on. That works too. Mr. Nobody's clearly in no kind of mental state to be making critical choices, and Mr. Happy understands this and decides that the best thing he can do for him is to help him. And in doing that, he is to take him home and show him a bit of hospitality. Eventually, they reached Mr. Happy's home and went into his living room. Mr. Happy pointed to a chair. "Sit yourself down," he said. It was really quite extraordinarily extraordinary seeing somebody who was nobody sitting in a chair. Mr. Happy sat down too, and thought hard, Mr. Happy sat down too, and thought hard. The wizard cried, Mr. Happy, of course. Punctuation is really throwing me off today. There's Mr. Nobody sitting in a blue chair. He appears kind of blue, however, he obviously isn't. You may assume that he's white, but that's just because his background is white in certain circumstance. He absorbs merely what is behind him. So, need to move my microphone a little bit away. It's picking up a bit too many audio spikes. But yeah, so Mr. Happy is wanting to turn to the arcane very quickly. Which, I mean, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely a bold choice. It's a bold choice. We're going to move the microphone a little bit farther away. So the following morning, after no breakfast, Mr. Happy took Mr. Nobody to see the wizard. "Ah," remarked the wizard after Mr. Happy tried to explain. "Ah," he said again, eyeing Mr. Nobody. Mr. Nobody just stood there, looking as glum as anyone can look. Just trying to turn the corners of your mouth down as far as they will go. Well, no. Just try turning the corners of your mouth down as far as they will go. Go on. Well, that's about half as glum as Mr. Nobody looked. The wizard thought and thought and thought some more. We see Mr. Happy, Mr. Nobody, and the wizard all having a great time, trying to get things figured out. And Mr. Nobody is most certainly devastated by everything happening to him. He struggles to find any joy in his current state of being, which is a very troublesome thing. Care for a cup of tea, he inquired. Nobodies don't drink anything, replied Mr. Nobody. Nobodies don't drink anything, said the wizard, correcting him. Whoa, no, I've had a stroke. Nobodies don't drink nothing, replied Mr. Nobody. Nobodies don't drink anything, said the wizard, correcting him. That's right, agreed Mr. Nobody. Aha, cried the wizard. That's it. The wizard rushed over to his workbench and started mixing up lots of different colored liquids in a huge bottle. They bubbled and gurgled together and let off little puffs of white smoke. Bubble, bubble, gurgle, puff. Bubble, bubble, gurgle, puff. And it's in fun font. Look at that fun font. It's at the bottom. It's very wavy. But the wizard has had a revelation by the word choice of Mr. Nobody. So clearly, he's made a breakthrough to some degree. How effective will it be? Let us see. What color would you like to be? The wizard asked Mr. Nobody. Nobodies aren't colored, came the sad reply. You choose, said the wizard, pointing at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy thought. Well, he said, I've always really rather quite enjoyed being yellow. Yellow it shall be, shouted the wizard as he poured more liquid into the bottle. Here they are scheming. Mr. Nobody is still very sad. Very sad. There's not much to say. It's just plot progression. There's not a lot of commentary I can make until the end of it, so it's interesting. Suddenly, with one huge puff of white smoke, the liquid turned bright yellow. Right, cried the wizard. Drink that. Nobodies don't drink nothin', said Mr. Nobody. Exactly, shouted the wizard at the top of his voice. Nobodies don't drink nothing. Therefore, nobodies must drink something. Mr. Nobody took hold of the bottle and took a small sip. More, cried the wizard. Much more. So Mr. Nobody's having to succumb to peer pressure right now, which is unfortunate. However, it seems to be for his good. And the wizard has caught Mr. Nobody in a double negative when he said nobodies don't drink nothing. Don't drink nothing, meaning that they drink something. So Mr. Nobody's like, I guess that's how it is. It's what we gotta do. So yeah. Mr. Nobody shut his eyes and took a deep breath and swallowed all of the liquid. Mr. Happy and the wizard watched and waited and waited and watched. Nothing happened. Told you so, said Mr. Nobody, and he sighed. Another one of those sighs that breaks your heart. And Mr. Nobody is depicted being very sad and very little changing about his appearance. Nothing at all, in fact, at this exact moment. So, yeah. Alrighty. But, wait a minute. Did their eyes deceive them, or They looked at Mr. Nobody's feet. They were turning sort of, yes, yellow. Yes, decidedly yellow. Definitely yellow. He's got yellow feet now. But he's still very sad. So that's how it is. Then Mr. Nobody's legs turned yellow, and then his body, and then his arms. His nose, Mr. Happy shouted. What about his nose? They watched and they waited and they waited and they watched. Nothing happened. His nose is still transparent. Somebody forgot to take the checkerboard background out of the JPEG. Funny, haha. So, what happened? What's going on with his nose? What's going on there? Suddenly, Mr. Nobody sneezed. And immediately after he sneezed, with an enormous pop at tissue pop, his nose turned yellow as well. Oh, I wish you'd been there to see Mr. Nobody's face. His mouth stopped turning down and started turning up, and up, and up, and up again. Well, chuckled Mr. Happy, I told you so. And Mr. Nobody's very happy now. He's very happy. That's cool. Everybody's a somebody. What? What? Why did... I have a lot of questions. Why did he need to become colored to be happy? Because it's implied that it is merely a cosmetic change. And that... Is this some deep metaphor that I'm not understanding, or is this wholeheartedly malarkey? I don't get it. Everybody's a somebody. That I agree with that. That's a good moral. But the route you took to get there. Why did becoming yellow make him happy? Why? What? Because it's a cosmetic change. That's it. Are we supposed to believe that that kind of pushed him over the edge and was like, now he's happy because he realized that he is somebody, and it only took a little bit of a push to make him realize that. That's what I'm gonna go with. That's what I'm going with. Everybody's a somebody, and Mr. Nobody struggled with his identity because he did not resemble the others, and he was transparent, which, I mean, I can't imagine that's good for self-esteem. I don't know, but I don't imagine it would be good for self-esteem. So in order to fix his situation, he assimilates, and then he's happy. Because now he realizes he's somebody. Even though all along he was somebody. But now he himself, he realizes it. It's just, you had a good start, had a good end. But the road you took to get there with this pigment potion, that's where the problems start. Is there something I'm missing? Am I missing something? Why does being colored make him so happy? it only changes the fact that he is no longer transparent. And as I said, it probably can't be good for self-esteem. But it shouldn't do that much. I'm gonna stop talking about this because it's just kind of making me angry a little bit. Decent message, muddy execution. That's Mr. Nobody. Wow, Mr. Small is like a masterpiece compared to this. This is okay. Yeah. I think that's the best way to put it. Good message, muddy execution. Well, thank you for joining me on this journey. What a time. Maybe I'll do another one. If you have any Mr. Men characters that have books that you would like to suggest me read, you can put them in the comments. I may take your suggestions if you put them, or I may not. I don't know. I've got a few more that I'm interested in doing, but Mr. Nobody is telling me that it really, these can be anything. It's a mystery it's an enigma when you open these up. So you can go on a premise, you go on character traits, but like at the end of the day, it's what's here. And you never know what you're gonna get. I'm gonna stop talking. Thanks for being here on this weird journey. I wasn't expecting Mr. Nobody to be this strange and convoluted. Have a good day. See you later. Try to stay safe. I appreciate you. Goodbye.